There is a specific kind of tiredness that many people carry, and it is surprisingly difficult to describe. It is not the tiredness that comes from a long day of physical work, the kind that makes your body feel heavy and your sleep feel earned. It is not grief, which has its own unmistakable weight. It is not illness, which at least announces itself with a name. It is something quieter than all of those, a low-grade, persistent weariness that settles in by Thursday afternoon and does not fully lift by Monday morning. You can feel it in the moment when you sit down to do something simple, check a bill, renew a subscription, update a piece of software, and realize that what should take 5 minutes will require you to remember a password you changed 6 months ago, navigate 3 screens you have never seen before, answer a security question you set up when the rules were different, and then confirm everything through an email that takes 4 minutes to arrive. And by the time you have done all of that, you have spent 20 minutes on something that should not have cost you anything at all. That is a small example. There are dozens of those small examples every week. But the tiredness is not just about individual tasks. It is the accumulation. It is the feeling that existence in the modern world has become a kind of ongoing administrative project, a long series of demands, each one seemingly reasonable on its own, that together add up to something that wears a person down without ever quite announcing that it is doing so. People are often reluctant to name this feeling directly. There is a suspicion that admitting to it is admitting to weakness, that younger people handle all of this easily, that competent adults should be able to manage, that the right response is simply to adapt and get on with it. And so many people carry this tiredness quietly, half believing it is their own fault. It is not their fault. What many people are experiencing is something real, something measurable, and something that deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as generational complaint. The world has become genuinely more demanding, more cognitively demanding, more administratively complex, more relentless in its appetite for attention. And the people who feel most tired by it are often those who were formed in a world that worked quite differently. Today, we are going to look at this honestly, not to complain, and not to suggest that the solution is simply working harder or adapting faster, but to understand what actually changed, why it costs what it costs, and what a more honest response to modern exhaustion might look like. To understand why modern daily life feels so tiring, it helps to understand what it looked like before, not in the golden, idealized way that nostalgia usually operates, but concretely, practically, in terms of what people were actually required to do from one day to the next. Think about managing a household in, say, 1975. You paid your bills by writing a check and mailing it, or by walking to the bank and handing over cash. You spoke to people on the telephone, actual people, not automated systems, and the conversation was usually brief and had a clear resolution. You did your grocery shopping at a store where someone at the checkout knew roughly how much things cost and could handle the transaction without your participation in a machine. You had one television set that received a handful of channels, and the choice of what to watch was settled in a few seconds. None of this was effortless. Life in 1975 had its own frustrations and its own complexities. But the demands it made were relatively stable. The skills you needed to navigate a Wednesday in 1975 were essentially the same skills you needed for the Wednesday before it. You were not constantly being asked to learn new interfaces, adopt new platforms, or update your understanding of how something worked. The environment was demanding, but it was legible. What replaced it is not simply more convenient. It is more complex, dramatically more complex, in ways that are easy to underestimate because the change happened gradually, over decades, and each individual addition seemed minor on its own. A new website here, a new account there, a new system for something that used to require no system at all. The numbers are instructive, even if they can only approximate the full picture. The average person today manages somewhere between 80 and 100 online accounts. Each one requires a unique password, or should, if they are taking security seriously. Most of those accounts require periodic updates, occasional re-authentication, and at least occasional navigation of an interface that was almost certainly redesigned at some point without asking whether the people using it wanted a redesign. Beyond the accounts, there is the sheer volume of choices. A streaming service offers thousands of films and series. A supermarket stocks tens of thousands of distinct products. A phone contains hundreds of apps, many of which require active management. Every decision, where to eat, what to watch, which version of a product to buy, now arrives embedded in a matrix of options and comparisons that simply did not exist in that form a generation ago. Psychologists have a term for what this produces: decision fatigue. The idea, supported by a substantial body of research, is that the capacity to make careful decisions is a limited resource. Every time you make a choice, even a small, trivial choice, you draw on that resource. By the end of a day that has required hundreds of small decisions, the quality of the decisions you make has declined, your patience has thinned, and your ability to engage thoughtfully with something complex has diminished. You are not mentally weaker than you were in the morning. You are simply depleted in a way that the morning will partially but not always fully repair. This is not a new observation. But what is newer is the environment. The fact that the number of decisions modern daily life requires has risen so substantially that many people are arriving at mid-morning with a level of depletion that would once have been expected by late afternoon. And then there is the question of pace. Not just the amount of change, but the rate. The world that existed in 1975 changed relatively slowly. The world today changes so quickly that staying current with how things work, how to pay a bill online, how to navigate a healthcare portal, how to use a new version of a piece of software, has become what might be called a part-time occupation. Not optional and not compensated. For people who grew up in the slower, more stable world, who were formed there, whose habits and reflexes were built in that environment, the contrast is not merely technological. It is deeply personal. They are not failing to keep up because they are incapable. They are finding the keeping up exhausting because the gap between the world they were shaped for and the world they are now asked to navigate is genuinely large. And it keeps widening. The cost of all this is not abstract. It shows up in small, specific, daily moments that many people recognize immediately when they are named, and feel a certain relief in having named. There is the experience of standing at a supermarket self-checkout with a trolley of ordinary groceries. The machine is confidently named something that suggests it is making your life easier. You scan the first item. It is fine. You scan the second. Something goes wrong. An unexpected item in the bagging area, an error message that requires staff assistance, a moment of quiet bewilderment as you look around for a human being who can help. The line behind you grows. You feel a pressure that has nothing to do with the groceries themselves, a faint pressure that suggests you are somehow doing this incorrectly, failing at a task that should be simple. That pressure is not in your imagination. It is real, and it is subtle. And it happens dozens of times a week in dozens of different contexts. There is the experience of trying to access a healthcare or insurance portal. You have not used it in 8 months because there was no reason to. Now there is a reason. You go to the website. Your password does not work. You request a new one. The email takes several minutes. You click the link. It has expired. You try again. You eventually succeed. Navigate several screens that seem to have been designed without much thought for what you actually came to do, and find, perhaps, what you were looking for. Or perhaps not. That sequence of events is not unusual. It is the ordinary texture of dealing with institutions and services in the modern world. And what it produces, day after day and task after task, is a quiet but accumulating resentment, not the hot resentment of a genuine injustice, but the tired resentment of someone who has been asked to perform a piece of theater to access something that is nominally there to serve them. There is also the subtler cost of what was removed. When a bank teller was replaced by an ATM, and the ATM was supplemented by an app, something more than convenience was reorganized. The brief human exchange that happened at a bank counter, the exchange that cost very little in time and produced very little in emotional weight but nevertheless represented a small contact with another person, was quietly eliminated. When you used to call a company and reach a person, that was not always efficient. But it was legible. You spoke, they responded, something happened or did not happen, and the interaction was complete. What replaced it? The automated phone system, the chatbot, the FAQ page, the form that must be submitted and then reviewed and then answered within 3 to 5 business days, is technically capable of producing the same outcomes. But it demands more of you. It demands patience, navigation, literacy in specific systems, and a tolerance for ambiguity that many people were never trained to have and have every right to find exhausting. And then there is the confidence problem. For people who lived most of their adult lives in a world that was structured differently, repeated small failures in digital systems can produce something that goes beyond inconvenience. There is a particular kind of humiliation in being stumped by something that the system implies is simple: a password reset, a form submission, a software update. It does not feel like a failure of the system. It feels, despite all evidence to the contrary, like a failure of the person. That is perhaps the most corrosive part of the human cost. Not the time lost, not the frustration, but the quiet erosion of confidence that comes from a world that increasingly implies you are the problem. It is worth asking a question that does not come up often enough in conversations about technology in modern life. Who designed this environment, and what were they optimizing for? The answer, in most cases, is not comfort. It is not rest. It is not the dignified and unhurried management of an ordinary life. The digital environment that most of us navigate every day was built primarily by technology companies whose business model depends on capturing and holding attention. Not briefly, continuously. The longer you stay on a platform, the more value it extracts from your presence. The more engaged you are, the more data it can collect, the more advertising it can serve, the more profitable your time becomes for someone other than yourself. This is what is sometimes called the attention economy. It is not a neutral phrase. The word economy is used deliberately, because attention has become a scarce resource that is bought and sold, and because you are on the selling side of that transaction whether you agreed to be or not. The design consequences of this are visible everywhere. Notifications are not designed to inform you efficiently and leave you alone. They are designed to bring you back. The feed that never ends is not designed to give you what you came for. It is designed to keep you looking for it indefinitely. The app that asks for permission to send you alerts is not doing so because it needs to reach you urgently. It is doing so because every moment of re-engagement extends the relationship the platform has with your attention. None of this is secret. Technology critics and former engineers at major companies have written and spoken about it at length. But knowing the mechanism does not necessarily protect you from it. The systems are sophisticated enough that knowing how they work does not much diminish their effect on how you feel. You still feel the pull of the notification. You still feel the mild anxiety of an unanswered message. You still find yourself checking a screen in a quiet moment, not because you need to, but because the environment trained you to. The result is something researchers have begun to describe as baseline alertness, a state of mild, chronic vigilance that many people now carry through their waking hours. You are not always doing something, but you are always available to do something. You are never fully out of reach, never fully absorbed in a task that excludes everything else, never completely at rest. And sustained alertness, the kind that goes on for years, woven into the ordinary texture of daily life, is deeply tiring in a way that is difficult to measure but easy to feel. The philosopher Barry Schwartz, in work that has become more rather than less relevant with time, described what he called the paradox of choice. The observation that an abundance of options, rather than increasing satisfaction, tends to produce paralysis, second-guessing, and diminished contentment. When there were 3 television channels, you watched what was on, or you did not. When there are 5,000 options, you spend 20 minutes choosing and then spend the first 10 minutes of whatever you chose wondering if you picked correctly. The choice itself has become a burden. Now scale that across an entire life. Across every meal, every purchase, every leisure activity, every communication channel, every form of entertainment. The cognitive burden of being a full participant in the modern world is enormous, and largely invisible, because it is distributed across so many small decisions that none of them individually appears to cost very much. For people who grew up before this world existed, who were formed in an environment where information arrived more slowly, choices were more limited, and the demands on attention were more structured, the gap between their formation and their current environment is not trivial. Their nervous systems were calibrated for something else. Their habits of rest, their assumptions about what a quiet afternoon should feel like, their sense of what is reasonable to expect from a day. All of these were established in a different context. And the constant demand to adapt and readapt to a world that keeps changing its rules is not simply inconvenient. It is, in the deepest sense, tiring. There is also a loss that goes beyond cognitive load, and it is the loss of boredom. This sounds, at first, like a strange thing to mourn. But undemanded time, time in which nothing is asked of you and no stimulus is available, is not simply a gap between activities. It is a resource. It is the condition under which the mind processes, integrates, reflects, and recovers. The moments of genuine quiet that used to be built into ordinary life, waiting for a bus, sitting in a waiting room, eating a meal without a screen nearby, were not wasted time. They were the space in which internal life happened. That space has been largely eliminated, not by force, but by design. Every moment of potential boredom has been filled with an available distraction, and most people have accepted the filling without quite noticing what they gave up to get it. What they gave up is the experience of being alone with their own thoughts without that being a deliberate and somewhat effortful act. The result is a kind of interior poverty that is very difficult to name while you are living inside it. A sense that life is full of activity and somehow still feels thin, that there is always something to do and never quite enough time to simply be. And that poverty compounds the exhaustion. You are spending energy on constant stimulation, while the recovery that rest and stillness would provide keeps getting deferred. There is something clarifying about understanding that your exhaustion is not a personal failure. It is easy to believe otherwise. The world around you, the advertisements, the productivity culture, the general social pressure to remain engaged, connected, and current, implies strongly that the appropriate response to complexity is mastery. Learn the system, adapt faster, stay relevant. The person who finds the self-checkout machine bewildering is implicitly the person who has not quite kept up, who has fallen behind in some important respect. But that framing is not honest, and it is not kind, and it does not survive much scrutiny. The systems that generate so much exhaustion were not designed with your well-being in mind. They were designed to capture and hold your attention, to extract engagement, to keep you present on platforms whose value depends on your continued presence. The fatigue you feel is accurate feedback from a person encountering an environment that was built for engagement, not rest. It is, in a very real sense, appropriate. That realization does not solve anything immediately. The accounts still need managing. The bills still need paying. The systems still ask what they ask. But something shifts when you stop framing your response to those demands as a measure of your competence. You are not failing to adapt. You are correctly perceiving that the demands are genuinely high. There is a difference, and it matters. The people who seem to navigate modern complexity with the most equanimity, and they exist, and it is worth paying attention to how they do it, are not always those who are most technically fluent. They are often those who have made deliberate decisions about what deserves their engagement and what does not. They have, in one way or another, become more selective. They have accepted that they will not be equally present in every system that claims a right to their time. They have protected certain hours, certain practices, certain categories of quiet that they treat as non-negotiable. That is not the same as withdrawal or defeat. It is, in many ways, a form of sophistication that takes years to develop. The recognition that attention is finite, that energy is finite, and that spending either of them on systems and demands that return very little value is a choice, not a requirement. Some of that selectivity is practical. More routine in daily decisions means fewer decisions, which means less fatigue. A morning that follows the same simple sequence every day costs less than a morning that requires improvisation. Knowing which systems are worth learning and which can be minimized or delegated, to a younger family member, to a simple workaround, to simply not using the service at all, is a form of cognitive conservation that is completely reasonable. Some of it is philosophical. The capacity to let certain things go without guilt, to say that a particular service, platform, or system is simply not worth the effort it requires, is a genuine act of self-respect. Not every demand is legitimate. Not every complexity needs to be mastered. The world will continue to function perfectly adequately if you do not update a particular app, maintain a particular account, or remain current with a particular version of something that was working perfectly well before it was changed. And some of it is simply the recognition that rest is not laziness. That quiet is not emptiness. That a day with fewer decisions and more stillness is not a lesser day. The evening walk that requires no password, the book that has no notification, the conversation that asks nothing except presence, these are not retreats from life. They are, in a very real sense, the point of it. Perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about modern exhaustion is this: the world became more demanding than it announced it was going to be. The trade-offs were not clearly explained. The cost of constant connectivity, constant choice, and constant adaptation was not itemized before most people agreed to participate. And so many people find themselves deep in a way of life that is efficient in some ways and quietly exhausting in others, without having quite chosen it consciously. That is not something to be angry about. It is something to understand clearly, and then to respond to, as much as possible, on your own terms. Not to reject the modern world, which is neither possible nor the point, but to inhabit it more deliberately, to decide what deserves your time and your limited attention, and to give yourself, without apology, the rest that every honest person knows they need. Fact check notes. Verify estimates on average number of decisions a person makes per day. The commonly cited figure of 35,000 is disputed. Prefer a more conservative framing or omit the number. Verify research on decision fatigue. Roy Baumeister's original ego depletion research has had replication issues. Cite with appropriate qualification or reference more recent meta-analyses. Verify statistics on average number of online accounts or passwords per person in the US. Figures from NordPass or similar password manager research are available but vary by year. Verify Barry Schwartz's paradox of choice research and any subsequent updates or critiques since the 2004 publication. Verify claims about the attention economy. Tristan Harris, the Center for Humane Technology, and related sources are citable. Ensure no claims attribute motives beyond what is documented. Verify any neuroscience claims about how older adults process cognitive load differently from younger adults. This is an active area of research with nuance worth preserving. Verify that the general characterization of digital platform design around engagement maximization is supported by publicly available material from engineers or executives at major platforms.